This is Kathy from Gadgetstop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Akkerman Dutch Masters Israel Zeeblauw, or Zeeblauw. I'm going to be testing it in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And the pen I'm featuring today is the Pilot Custom 74. This one has a 14 karat fine nib, and I'm including it today because the 14 karat fine nib writes a little bit differently than the steel fine nib, and I want to compare the two, just see what the difference is. This is an ink that has some shading characteristics to it, so I wanted to see how those compare. I'm going to start with the Pilot Extra Fine. And this is a Pilot 78G. I'm feeling the feedback that you would expect with the extra fine nib, but it doesn't feel scratchy. Okay. And that looks nice. It's legible. Next, I have a Pilot Prera with a fine nib. Now, normally I feel there's quite a jump in the smoothness that I feel when I'm going from the extra fine to the fine, but I didn't notice a huge jump. It was slightly smoother, but still I felt that feedback that you would expect from a fine nib. Next, I've got the Custom 74 that it has a fine nib, but this one's a gold nib. Now this one is smoother, and I appear to be putting down more ink. Yeah, quite a bit wetter, quite a bit more ink. And one thing, this is what I notice when I'm writing with the Custom 74. The steel nibs tend to put down a uniform line of ink. And one of the things I always notice with this gold nib is, I think it's on upstrokes, see how the top of those loops are paler than the bottom of the loops. But I didn't notice it as much in the rest of the writing, but I print. Maybe if you write in cursive, you would notice it more. All right, next, I'm going back to the steel nibs. This is a Pilot Custom 74 with a medium nib. That's 78G plus. With a medium nib. I was just thinking that there's not a whole lot of difference in this medium and the fine in terms of the amount of ink that it's putting down. The line is a little bit finer now that the two are drying, but the feel of it on the paper, they were putting down similar amounts of ink. Okay, next I've got a Nemesign Singularity with the 0.6 stub nib. Okay. I've also got a Pilot Pereira with a cursive medium. Sometimes it's called, you'll see it labeled as a 1.0 stub nib. Now normally this cursive medium is very smooth, but I'm feeling it's feeling kind of dry on the paper. It's not as smooth as normal. Yeah, those side strokes, I'm feeling the nib want to dig into the paper, and this isn't a very sharp, well, it's much sharper than the Nemesign, the edges of the nib, but normally it's a very smooth writing experience. Finally, I've got my 1.5 stub. All right. Now, while we're waiting for that to dry, it shouldn't take very long. This is you'll see on these other paper samples where I would draw my X and smear it. There's not a lot of ink that smears. Look at the stub. This ink tends to soak into the paper and dry very quickly. And one of the things I noticed, paper plays a big role in the kind of writing experience you have with this ink. I didn't really like it on this ARC notebook paper. Some of the pens, like this stub nib, the paper didn't want to grab the ink. Look on the downstroke there. It's just real spindly. Finally, it kind of grabbed the paper over here, but then on the T, it didn't want to write, excuse me, the downstroke. The downstroke, see how normally these are really wide. And so, let me see, even on my Pilot Custom 74 that we saw puts down a decent amount of ink on the Tomoe River paper, it had trouble wanting to get started. And the pen that I really looked forward to using this in the most was the Pilot Pereira. And look, it doesn't even look like a stub nib right here. Kind of like this 1.5 stub, the paper didn't want to grab the ink. And I noticed, see on the swirlies, sometimes it would grab it, sometimes it wouldn't. It was just real inconsistent. And one of the things I noticed when I originally tested this ink, I tested it in the Pilot Pereira, and usually when I started writing with it each day, it didn't want to write the first letter. I would have to go over it twice. And I've heard other people have similar issues with this ink. It's just, it is a drier ink. It's not watery like Diamine Earl Grey and some inks like that fit, some of those inks that feel dry. This doesn't really feel dry on the paper. It just, the ink doesn't want to flow out of the nib under certain circumstances. Let's see, on my Rhodia paper here, let's see, it looked pretty good. The extra fine nib tends to be a little bit too fine. The readback on it is not that great. And like I mentioned on the Tomoe River paper, there wasn't a big jump in how these two felt on the paper. There wasn't a jump in smoothness. Let's see, it's a nice looking ink though. My Pilot Pereira, notice here on the P, I think I had to write that P twice. Side strokes are pretty dry. My little swirlies here, I don't know, just don't look as good as they normally do. Let's see, on my 20-pound copy paper, it felt decent in the extra fine. It didn't feel, the scratchiness didn't jump out at me. It wasn't notably smooth. It was acceptable. Now normally, like I've mentioned on the other papers, normally there's a big jump in smoothness when you go from extra fine to fine. There wasn't here. You see, let's see, not a tremendous amount of feathering when you get up to this wetter nib. Let's see what and this was not bad. The bleeding through the paper was not bad at all. The only one that there's noticeable bleed through is the 0.6 stub and the 1.5 stub. Okay, so this wasn't bad on copy paper in a variety of nibs, as long as they're not too wide. Up to a medium, I would say. Let's take a look at my Leuchtturm, my little writing sample that I did. It's a nice looking ink. It's very similar, just a little bit lighter than Yamadori, but it's much drier. Let's see. I'm starting to see, now this was a lot of ink dumped on the page. I'm starting to see just the slightest hint of a halo of red sheen. But like the shading in that L, very pretty, but unfortunately it seems to be very picky about what pen and paper you use. Okay, yeah, on the Nemasine 0.6 and the 1.5 stub, I'm seeing a hint of red sheen, some subtle shading. That's pretty. I really liked this ink in my Pilot Pereira, but I don't know. It just doesn't perform the best, and I don't like how it feels on the paper. That's the kicker. It's just not very smooth. I ended up liking it best as far as writing, how it felt on the paper, in the Custom 74. Now, the reason I went back and chose this one to test is because I was considering getting a bottle of this, and you know Akkerman bottles are pretty large, and I've decided against it. I like having an ink sample of this, but if it's not going to perform at its best in a variety of my nibs, I can't just, since I use fine nibs, that's just not worth it to me. But if you're going to get this to use in like a broad nib, I think it performs great. It was nice in the Nemasine. So if you're going to be using it in a really wet nib, I think this is a great ink. But for drier nibs, it's just not going to work for me. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.